Hey guys, tonight we're travelling back to Victorian England, where the air hangs heavy with coal smoke and the distinct odour of questionable medical practices. You're walking down a cobblestone street past an elegant townhouse where, behind lace curtains, a doctor in a fine frock coat is about to treat a feverish patient with remedies that would make your modern doctor call the police. If you lived in this era and fell seriously ill, your chances of survival would probably be better if you just stayed home and hoped for the best, rather than summoning a physician. If this is helping your restless mind slow down, gently tap that like button and subscribe to our historical sleep journeys. I invite you to share your location and local time in the comments so we can know where our community of dreamers is joining us from. Now, prepare your environment, reduce the brightness of your room, rest your eyes momentarily while taking 3 deep breaths, and let's gently navigate together through this narrative that will lead us to rest. The Victorian era, spanning Queen Victoria's reign from 1837 to 1901, marked a peculiar transition in medical history. You're witnessing a profession caught between ancient beliefs and modern discoveries, creating a perfect storm of dangerous experimentation. The typical Victorian doctor you might encounter presents himself as a scientific man, yet his methods often harken back to medieval superstitions dressed up in fancy new terminology. As you peek into a Victorian medical office, you notice the doctor's impressive diplomas hanging on the wall. What those framed certificates don't tell you is that until the Medical Act of 1858, practically anyone could call themselves a doctor. You might be treated by someone who studied for years at a prestigious university, or by someone who simply purchased a degree from a diploma mill and learned their trade by watching others inflict suffering, healing. Historians still argue about whether Victorian doctors killed more patients than they saved during this period. The evidence doesn't look good for Team Doctor. Statistics from Victorian hospitals show that patients who received the most advanced treatments often fared worse than those who were simply kept clean and fed. As you observe Victorian medical practice, you notice an unsettling pattern. Medical theories change with alarming frequency, but the core treatments remain oddly consistent: purging, bleeding, blistering, and drugging patients into oblivion. It's as if the doctors have a set of favorite tortures they're determined to use regardless of the diagnosis. The Victorian era witnessed germ theory slowly overtaking miasma theory, the ancient belief that disease spread through bad air, or miasmas. Yet even as some doctors began to accept the existence of microorganisms, they continued prescribing remedies based on humoral medicine dating back to Hippocrates and Galen. You can almost see the cognitive dissonance on their faces as they wash their hands with carbolic acid before proceeding to bleed a patient to balance their humours. What makes Victorian medicine particularly bizarre is its intersection with industrial innovation. You're living through the age of steam and electricity, watching as doctors eagerly apply these new technologies to human bodies with little understanding of their effects. Imagine your physician enthusiastically describing how he plans to run electric currents through your body to cure your headaches, a treatment that might actually be less dangerous than some of his chemical concoctions. Class distinctions heavily influence the medical care you receive. If you're wealthy, you enjoy private consultations in your home, with the doctor taking care to make his treatments somewhat tolerable. If you're poor, you might end up in a teaching hospital where students practice their techniques on you, while professors use your suffering as educational material. Note how the patient writhes when the caustic is applied, the doctor might say to his students as you struggle not to scream. Medicine in this era is also distinctly gendered. Male doctors claim authority over female patients' bodies, while simultaneously declaring women too delicate to understand medical concepts. Yet paradoxically, all home nursing falls to women, who quietly manage most day-to-day health issues with herbal remedies passed down through generations. Remedies that sometimes work better than the doctor's scientific treatments. As night falls across Victorian London, you drift past pharmacy windows displaying colourful bottles of patent medicines, secret formulas promising to cure everything from cancer to corns. The public consumes these unregulated concoctions by the gallon, often containing alcohol, opiates, and heavy metals. It's self-medication on a societal scale, and a testament to how desperate people are to avoid the official medical treatments of the day. Section 2. You've entered the consulting room of a respectable Victorian physician who has just diagnosed you with nearly any ailment imaginable, from gout to melancholia, from typhoid to nervous exhaustion. Regardless of your specific complaint, there's one treatment he's almost certainly going to recommend: bloodletting. The doctor reaches for his case of medical instruments with a practiced flourish, revealing an array of gleaming blades, cups, and, yes, even jars of leeches. You try not to visibly recoil. The blood is where disease resides, he explains confidently, rolling up your sleeve. By removing the tainted blood, we restore the body's natural balance. You're experiencing firsthand one of medicine's oldest and most persistent therapies. The practice of bloodletting stretches back thousands of years, but the Victorians elevated it to something of an art form, complete with specialized tools and pseudoscientific justifications. As the doctor considers his options for extracting your blood, you realize he has quite the arsenal at his disposal. For a precise removal, he might select a phleem or scarificator, spring-loaded devices with multiple blades that slice your skin with mechanical efficiency. The scarificator's 15 blades snap out simultaneously with a sickening click, creating neat parallel cuts that immediately well with blood. These tools were considered more sophisticated than the simple lancets used in earlier centuries, though the underlying principle remained unchanged. Blood out, health presumably in. If your condition seems particularly severe, the doctor might opt for wet cupping. You watch nervously as he places a heated glass cup against your skin. As the cup cools, it creates suction, drawing your flesh up in a bulging mound. After removing the cup, he makes several swift incisions and reapplies it, now collecting the blood that flows from the wounds. The process is repeated until he's satisfied with the quantity extracted, often several ounces, sometimes much more. For what the Victorians considered delicate conditions, especially those affecting women and children, leeches were the preferred bloodletting method. You might find yourself with several of these slimy creatures attached to your skin, each drinking about a tablespoon of blood before dropping off in sated contentment. Victorian hospitals maintained leech houses where thousands of these creatures were kept for medical use. By mid-century, the demand for medicinal leeches had grown so enormous that they were being imported by the millions, decimating European leech populations. What's especially unsettling about Victorian bloodletting is the sheer quantity of blood physicians believed beneficial to remove. During severe illness, you might lose a pint or more in a single session, with treatments repeated daily. Some medical records document patients losing over half their blood volume during the course of treatment, an amount now known to cause hypovolemic shock and death. Yet when patients died following such aggressive bloodletting, their deaths were attributed to the original disease being too advanced, rather than the treatment itself. Historians still argue about why bloodletting persisted so stubbornly in the Victorian era, despite mounting evidence of its ineffectiveness or outright harm. Some suggest it survived because it occasionally provided relief for certain conditions, reducing blood pressure in hypertensive patients, for instance, or temporarily alleviating the fluid buildup of congestive heart failure. These rare successes might have confirmed doctors' belief in the practice's overall validity. The bloodletting boom wasn't limited to hospital wards or doctors' offices. You could purchase do-it-yourself bloodletting kits for home use, complete with instructional pamphlets. Imagine trying to convince your squeamish spouse to apply leeches to your back because you've been feeling a bit tired lately. Victorian family health manuals included helpful tips for storing and applying leeches, with advice like placing a teaspoon of sugar water on the skin to encourage reluctant leeches to bite. How thoughtful. Despite its popularity, bloodletting began facing scientific scrutiny during the Victorian period. You might have been fortunate enough to encounter a physician influenced by Pierre Louis, a French doctor who conducted one of the first clinical trials in the 1830s. His study of pneumonia patients showed that those treated with bloodletting actually fared worse than those who received less aggressive interventions. Though his findings were initially controversial, they represented an early triumph of statistical analysis over traditional medical dogma. The practice began declining in the late Victorian era, though not without resistance from the medical establishment. If you visited a doctor in the 1890s, you'd still find bloodletting in their arsenal, but it would likely be reserved for specific conditions rather than prescribed universally. The transition wasn't clean or quick. Many doctors continued defending bloodletting well into the 20th century, arguing that modern medicine had mistakenly abandoned a valuable therapy. What's perhaps most remarkable about Victorian bloodletting is how it represents the strange marriage of ancient practice with modern technology. You might be bled using a state-of-the-art mechanical scarificator manufactured in Birmingham's industrial factories, with the blood collected in graduated cylinders to ensure scientific precision, all in service of a medical theory first proposed by Hippocrates nearly 2,500 years earlier. It's as if the Victorians were determined to make bloodletting respectable by dressing it up in the trappings of industrial progress. Section 3. As you recover from your bloodletting session, the Victorian doctor notes your continued symptoms with a thoughtful frown. What you need, he declares, reaching for his medicine cabinet, is a course of mercurials. Your heart sinks as he produces a small blue pill, the infamous blue mass, rolling it between his fingers before offering it to you with complete confidence. Little does either of you realize that you're about to ingest one of history's most notorious medical poisons disguised as a cure. Mercury, that silvery liquid metal now known to be profoundly toxic, was the Victorian medical establishment's wonder drug. You're witnessing the culmination of centuries of medical tradition that elevated this element to near miraculous status. Physicians prescribed it for practically everything: constipation, depression, toothaches, syphilis, typhoid fever, parasites, and even childbirth complications. It was medicine's equivalent of a Swiss Army knife, the treatment to reach for regardless of the problem. The forms of mercurial medicine you might encounter varied widely, each with its own charming set of toxic effects. Calomel, mercurous chloride, was particularly popular, prescribed as a purgative and general cure-all. Blue mass pills containing mercury with chalk, licorice, honey, rosewater, and glycerin were considered a milder option for chronic conditions. For external applications, mercury ointments were rubbed directly onto the skin, allowing this neurotoxin efficient entry into your bloodstream. How convenient. What made mercury so appealing to Victorian doctors was its visible and dramatic effects on the body. After taking your blue pill, you would experience profuse salivation, sometimes producing quarts of saliva daily, along with painful swelling of your gums and tongue, loosening teeth, and foul breath. Far from seeing these as warning signs of poisoning, doctors interpreted these symptoms as evidence the medicine was working by expelling disease from your body. The treatment is progressing nicely, your doctor might say, as you drool uncontrollably into a basin. Mercury's role in treating syphilis cemented its reputation as indispensable. In an era before antibiotics, mercury seemed to provide relief from this dreaded disease. The treatment protocol was captured in a grim saying you might hear whispered, "A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury." Syphilis patients endured years of mercury treatments, with dosages increasing until they showed signs of poisoning. The mercury might eventually suppress symptoms of the disease, if it didn't kill you first, leading doctors to believe in its efficacy. The irony of mercury treatments is that they often created symptoms worse than those of the original illness. You might seek help for minor constipation, only to develop tremors, memory loss, depression, kidney damage, and eventually, madness. These new symptoms would be diagnosed as a progression of your disease, or as an entirely new condition, prompting, you guessed it, more mercury. Historians still argue about how many Victorian patients were actually suffering from iatrogenic mercury poisoning rather than their diagnosed conditions. Despite mercury's prominence in formal medicine, some Victorian physicians began questioning its use. You might have been fortunate enough to consult a doctor influenced by the emerging therapeutic nihilism movement, which advocated for letting diseases run their natural course rather than intervening with harmful treatments. These skeptical practitioners pointed out that mercury therapy violated medicine's fundamental principle. First, do no harm. The toxic legacy of mercury extended beyond the patient to the physician and pharmacist. You can sometimes identify a Victorian doctor's shop by the distinctive tremors of its proprietor. Chemists who prepared mercurial compounds often developed hatter's shakes, named after the similar condition affecting hat makers who used mercury to cure felt. These professional hazards were considered an acceptable occupational risk, a small price to pay for wielding such a powerful medicine. Mercury's victims included some of the era's most prominent figures. You've probably heard that Lewis Carroll's Mad Hatter character was inspired by the neurological damage suffered by hatters exposed to mercury. But did you know that Charles Darwin was prescribed mercury for his chronic illness? His mysterious lifelong health problems, including tremors, digestive issues, and neurological symptoms, match the profile of chronic mercury poisoning, possibly caused by the very treatments meant to cure him. The domestic medicine cabinet in a typical middle-class Victorian home would likely contain some form of mercury. Patent medicines like Dr. Wright's Universal Pills or Beecham's Pills frequently contained mercury compounds, often undisclosed on their colourful labels. You might be dosing yourself and your family with mercury while believing you were taking a gentle herbal remedy. Even children weren't spared. Mercury was a common ingredient in teething powders, causing a condition later recognized as acrodynia, or pink disease. What makes the Victorian mercury obsession particularly fascinating is its persistence in the face of mounting evidence of harm. You're observing a medical establishment so committed to its traditional remedies that it reinterpreted obvious poisoning symptoms as healing processes. When patients recovered despite mercury treatment, doctors credited the mercury. When patients died, they blamed the disease for being too powerful. This circular logic helped mercury maintain its medical status despite growing scientific understanding of its dangers. The phrase "mad as a hatter" entered everyday language during this period, yet the connection between mercury and madness wasn't enough to dislodge it from medicine cabinets. Not until the early 20th century would mercury finally begin its retreat from mainstream medicine, though it persisted in some treatments well into the 1950s. You're witnessing one of medicine's longest-running mistakes, a toxic relationship that spanned centuries and claimed countless victims in the name of healing. Section 4. While you're still recovering from your mercurial treatment, your Victorian physician grows concerned about your sluggish vital forces. His eyes light up as he wheels in his newest acquisition, a gleaming electrical apparatus with brass fittings, glass tubes, and ominous wires. Science's greatest gift to medicine, he announces proudly, connecting the electrodes. This will enliven your nervous system and restore vitality to your organs. You're about to experience firsthand the Victorian obsession with electricity as medicine. The Victorian era coincided with humanity's growing understanding and harnessing of electrical power, and medical practitioners were eager to apply this mysterious force to healing. You're witnessing a time when electricity transformed from scientific curiosity to medical panacea with remarkable speed. After Luigi Galvani discovered in the 1780s that frog legs twitched when touched with metal during lightning storms, the notion that electricity represented life's fundamental force took hold in the medical imagination. As the doctor attaches wires to various parts of your body, you experience the strange marriage of cutting-edge technology with medieval medical theories. Electrical treatments were justified using ancient Galenic concepts of vital fluids and nervous energy, reimagined for the industrial age. Your physician explains that disease results from imbalances or blockages in your body's natural electrical currents. A theory that sounds scientific, but has about as much evidence supporting it as the humoral theory it partially replaced. The sensation of your first electrical treatment is unlike anything you've experienced before. Depending on the device being used, you might feel anything from a gentle tingling to painful muscle contractions or even full body seizures. The famous Victorian neurologist J. Russell Reynolds described the ideal electrical dose as one that produced moderate pain and muscular contraction. Comfort was never the Victorian medical system's primary concern. The variety of electrical devices used on Victorian patients would impress even the most gadget-obsessed modern technophile. You might be treated with Faraday batteries, which produced alternating current for muscle stimulation, galvanic cells delivering direct current for deeper conditions, static electricity generators for surface complaints, or even electric baths, where you would soak in water through which currents passed directly into your body. Each came with its own elaborate set of claims and equally elaborate set of risks. One particularly popular form of electrical treatment you might encounter is the hydroelectric bath, combining two Victorian medical obsessions, water and electricity. You would sit in a bathtub with your head emerging from a wooden cover, while electrodes in the water conducted current through your submerged body. The fact that this treatment combined water and electricity with minimal safety precautions somehow didn't raise as many red flags as it should have. No need to worry about those occasional electrocution deaths, just signs the treatment was potent. Electrical treatments weren't limited to hospital settings. By the 1890s, you could purchase home electrotherapy devices through mail-order catalogues. These range from electric belts promising to cure everything from impotence to kidney disease, to electric hairbrushes said to prevent baldness and headaches. The pulvermacher chain, a battery-powered device worn around the waist, was marketed as a cure for nervous debility, Victorian code for sexual dysfunction. Imagine explaining that particular purchase to your nosy Victorian neighbours. What's particularly striking about Victorian electrical medicine is how it blurred the line between legitimate medical treatment and outright quackery. You might receive electrical therapy from a distinguished physician at a teaching hospital, or from a travelling medicine show huckster, often using nearly identical devices and claims. When Dr. James Graham opened his Temple of Health in London, offering treatments in an electrical bed that supposedly cured infertility, was he practicing medicine or showmanship? In Victorian electrical therapy, the line was remarkably blurry. Historians still argue about whether these electrical treatments provided any real medical benefits beyond placebo effects. Some applications, like using galvanic current to treat certain neuromuscular conditions, may have offered genuine therapeutic value. Others, like claiming electric belts could cure tuberculosis, were pure fantasy. The problem was that Victorian doctors themselves couldn't distinguish between the two, lacking both the theoretical framework and testing methods to separate effective treatments from useless or harmful ones. Electric shock therapy found particular favor for treating women's complaints and mental illness, two areas where Victorian medicine was especially misguided. You might be prescribed electrical stimulation for hysteria, neurasthenia, or nervous exhaustion, regardless of the actual cause of your symptoms. By applying electricity to the spine, head, or reproductive organs, doctors claimed to restore proper nervous function. When patients improved after discontinuing other harmful treatments and receiving these electrical therapies instead, electricity got the credit. Despite questionable benefits, electrical medicine helped advance medical practice in unexpected ways. You're witnessing the beginning of medicine's technological age, when diagnosis and treatment started incorporating instruments beyond the doctor's basic senses. The same Victorian doctors who applied electricity with little understanding of its effects were also developing early versions of medical imaging, monitoring devices, and diagnostic tools. Their enthusiasm for technology, however misapplied, helped transform medicine from an art into a science. The electric craze persisted throughout the Victorian era, eventually evolving into more focused and sometimes legitimate applications. You can trace a direct line from Victorian electrotherapy to modern transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation, TENS, for pain management, electrical muscle stimulation in physical therapy, and even electroconvulsive therapy for severe depression. The difference is that modern applications rely on understanding mechanisms rather than vague notions of stimulating vital forces. As your electrical treatment concludes, the doctor nods with satisfaction at your flushed face and racing pulse, signs that your vital energy is properly stimulated. What he's actually observing are your body's stress responses to electrical stimulation, but in the Victorian medical model, that counts as improvement. When you return home, slightly dazed and with minor burns where the electrodes were attached, you might wonder if the cure is worse than the disease. But take heart, at least electricity is cleaner than leeches and less toxic than mercury. Usually. Section 5. Your Victorian medical adventure continues as the doctor notices your pained expression following the electrical treatment. "I see you're suffering," he says with uncharacteristic sympathy, reaching for a small brown bottle. "This will ease your discomfort." He measures a spoonful of dark liquid that smells faintly of flowers and spice. This is laudanum, the Victorian era's miracle medicine, and you're about to join the ranks of countless Victorians who drifted through life in an opium-induced haze. Laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, stands as perhaps the most widely consumed medicine of the Victorian age. You'd find it in virtually every household medicine cabinet, prescribed for everything from coughs to cancer, anxiety to arthritis. This potent mixture contained approximately 10% opium by weight, mixed with alcohol that could reach 90 proof. A typical dose contained roughly 10 milligrams of morphine, enough to significantly affect even an adult with no previous exposure. Yet Victorian doctors handed it out like candy, and families administered it to members of all ages, including infants. As the laudanum takes effect, you understand its appeal immediately. The pain that brought you to the doctor fades away, replaced by a pleasant warmth spreading through your limbs. Your anxiety dissolves, and the world takes on a dreamy, distant quality. This is the peace draft that Victorian literature references so frequently, a chemical vacation from the harsh realities of industrial life. What your doctor doesn't mention is how quickly your body will come to crave this feeling, or how devastating the consequences of that craving can become. The accessibility of laudanum in Victorian society would shock modern sensibilities. You could purchase it without prescription from any grocer, pharmacist, or street vendor for just a few pennies per ounce, cheaper than gin or beer. Marketed under names like Mother Bailey's Quieting Syrup or Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, laudanum was advertised as suitable for all ages. Victorian mothers routinely dosed crying babies with these soothing syrups, unaware they were essentially giving infants cocktails of alcohol and morphine. Many children became addicted before they could walk, and some never walked at all, dying from respiratory depression after an accidental overdose. What makes the Victorian laudanum phenomenon particularly striking is its social acceptability. Unlike today's stigmatized view of opioid use, Victorian society viewed laudanum consumption as perfectly respectable, even fashionable in certain circles. You might take your daily dose at the breakfast table alongside your tea, discussing the weather while measuring out liquid oblivion. Only when consumption became visibly excessive did it raise eyebrows, and even then, it was viewed more as a regrettable habit than a serious medical problem or moral failing. The Victorian era's literary giants provide some of the most vivid accounts of laudanum's effects. You might recognize your own post-laudanum sensations in Samuel Taylor Coleridge's description of a spot of enchantment, a green spot of fountains and flowers and trees in the very heart of a waste of sands. Coleridge composed his famous poem Kubla Khan during an opium dream, though he claimed to have been interrupted before he could complete the work. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Wilkie Collins, and countless other Victorian writers were regular laudanum users, their works sometimes reflecting opium's dreamlike influence. Historians still argue about the true extent of laudanum addiction in Victorian society. Some estimate that as many as 1 in 10 adults were regular users, with higher rates among the middle and upper classes who could more easily afford daily consumption. Working class use tended to be more intermittent, though no less problematic when it occurred. What's certain is that many Victorian medical complaints that brought patients back to doctors again and again, insomnia, digestive troubles, nervousness, were actually withdrawal symptoms from previous laudanum prescriptions. The gendered aspects of Victorian laudanum use reveal much about the era's approach to women's health. You'd find laudanum particularly recommended for female complaints, the catch-all term for everything from menstrual cramps to postpartum depression. When Victorian women exhibited signs of restlessness or dissatisfaction with their restricted lives, doctors often prescribed laudanum to render them docile and compliant. It's hard not to see this as a form of chemical restraint, a way to manage women who might otherwise challenge societal norms. The medical profession's complicity in spreading opiate addiction represents one of Victorian medicine's most profound failures. Your doctor prescribes laudanum so readily because he genuinely believes in its benefits while remaining willfully blind to its risks. Medical journals of the period contain thousands of articles praising opiates, but remarkably few acknowledging addiction potential. When physicians did recognize problematic use, they often prescribed, incredibly, more laudanum, believing that withdrawal symptoms indicated the body's need for the drug rather than dependence on it. As the century progressed, laudanum's darker aspects became increasingly difficult to ignore. You might notice newspaper accounts of laudanum poisonings, both accidental and intentional, becoming more common. Laudanum emerged as a favored method of suicide among Victorian women, who could easily access the drug without raising suspicions. The ambiguity of laudanum deaths — was it accident, suicide, or murder — features prominently in Victorian sensation novels, reflecting genuine societal anxiety about the drug's prevalence. By the late Victorian period, medical opinion finally began shifting against unrestricted laudanum use. You might encounter one of the progressive physicians who recognized addiction as a genuine medical condition rather than a moral weakness. These doctors advocated for greater regulation and more careful prescribing practices. Their efforts would eventually lead to the first meaningful restrictions on opiate sales in the early 20th century, though not before laudanum had created generations of addicts. The legacy of Victorian laudanum use extends far beyond its immediate victims. You're witnessing the beginnings of the modern pharmaceutical industry and the complicated relationship between pain management and addiction that continues to challenge medicine today. The Victorian laudanum epidemic bears striking parallels to the current opioid crisis, with similar patterns of overprescription, pharmaceutical company influence, and societal denial preceding recognition of the problem. Some lessons, it seems, must be painfully relearned by each generation. Section 6. While the laudanum dulls your pain and clouds your mind, your Victorian physician turns his attention to your pallid complexion. "A most concerning sign," he mutters, scribbling a prescription. "What you need is Fowler's solution. It will bring roses back to your cheeks." What he doesn't mention is that this popular tonic contains potassium arsenite. Yes, arsenic, the same substance used to poison unwanted spouses in countless Victorian murder mysteries. Yet somehow, you're supposed to drink it for your health. Arsenic stands as one of the most paradoxical substances in Victorian medicine, simultaneously recognized as a deadly poison and prescribed as a powerful tonic. You've entered a medical twilight zone where the line between remedy and toxin blurs beyond recognition. Arsenic compounds were prescribed for fevers, headaches, diabetes, asthma, rheumatism, and even as a general health booster. The Victorian medical mindset reasoned that substances causing violent reactions in large doses must stimulate healing in smaller ones, a dangerous oversimplification that led to countless cases of chronic poisoning. Fowler's solution, your newly prescribed tonic, was the most famous arsenical preparation, created by Dr. Thomas Fowler in 1786, but reaching peak popularity during the Victorian era. This potassium arsenite mixture came with precise dosing instructions, from 3 to 12 drops, depending on the patient's age and condition. You're instructed to take your arsenic until your eyelids begin swelling slightly, a sign of mild arsenic toxicity that doctors interpreted as evidence the medicine was working. If you developed more serious symptoms like vomiting or diarrhea, you'd simply reduce the dose rather than discontinue this beneficial treatment. Arsenic's reputation as a beauty aid proves particularly fascinating. You notice that many fashionable Victorian women possess the coveted, consumptive look. Pale skin with just a hint of flushed cheeks, bright eyes, and an ethereal thinness. What you're actually seeing are the symptoms of chronic arsenic exposure. Women consumed arsenic preparations or used arsenic-containing cosmetics to achieve this fashionable pallor, literally poisoning themselves in beauty's name. The practice became so common that arsenic complexion wafers were openly advertised, promising women a beautiful transparency to the complexion. The Victorian arsenic trade operated with remarkably few restrictions. You could walk into any pharmacy and purchase arsenic for medicinal purposes with minimal questioning. Though the 1851 Arsenic Act required sellers to record purchases and buyers to sign a poison register, enforcement remained lax. The substance was so commonplace that it appeared in everyday household items, from green wallpaper, where copper arsenite created a vivid emerald color, to children's toys and food colorings. Your entire Victorian home might be slowly poisoning you, even without your doctor's help. What makes arsenic treatments particularly insidious is the way their short-term effects masquerade as benefits. After taking your prescribed Fowler's solution, you might indeed experience what Victorians called a tonic effect: increased energy, improved appetite, and a sense of well-being. These are actually early stress responses to arsenic exposure, your body mobilizing resources to deal with the poison. Victorian doctors interpreted these reactions as signs of improved health, rather than the beginning of systemic poisoning. Historians still argue about whether some arsenic preparations might have offered legitimate benefits for certain conditions despite their toxicity. Recent research suggests arsenic compounds can be effective against some parasitic infections and even certain forms of leukemia. Arsenic trioxide remains an FDA-approved treatment for acute promyelocytic leukemia. This has led some to speculate that Victorian physicians may have observed genuine improvements in patients with undiagnosed conditions that responded to arsenic, further reinforcing their belief in its general efficacy. The social dimensions of Victorian arsenic consumption reveal fascinating class differences. While working-class arsenic eaters in regions like Styria consumed the substance for increased stamina during physical labor, upper-class women used it primarily for cosmetic purposes. You might encounter factory girls taking arsenic to help them endure 14-hour workdays, while across town, society ladies consumed similar doses to achieve the fashionable pallor that indicated they never needed to work at all. Same poison, entirely different social functions. The environmental legacy of Victorian arsenic use persists into the present day. In areas where arsenic was mined or processed for medical and industrial purposes, soil contamination remains a serious issue more than a century later. You're participating in the creation of toxic hotspots that will remain dangerous to future generations long after the dubious benefits of your arsenic tonic have worn off. Victorian medicine's arsenic obsession represents one of history's largest deliberate releases of a known toxin into both human bodies and the environment. The most famous arsenic-related tragedy of the Victorian era occurred in 1858, when approximately 200 people were poisoned and 21 died after consuming arsenic-contaminated peppermint lozenges. A druggist's assistant at Bradford's Humbug factory had mistakenly used arsenic instead of plaster of Paris as a sugar substitute. The incident finally forced authorities to recognize the dangers of unrestricted arsenic availability, though regulations remained inadequate by modern standards. You might think twice about accepting candy from strangers after hearing about the Bradford Humbug poisoning. As your course of Fowler's solution continues, you begin experiencing the classic progression of chronic arsenic poisoning. First, the beneficial effects like increased energy, then gradually developing gastrointestinal issues, unusual skin pigmentation, characteristic raindrop pattern skin lesions, and peripheral nerve damage causing pins and needles sensations. Rather than recognizing these as poisoning symptoms, your doctor interprets them as new conditions requiring additional treatments, perhaps more arsenic in a different preparation, creating a nightmarish cascade of escalating toxicity. The gradual recognition of arsenic's dangers represents one of the Victorian era's important transitions toward modern pharmacology. You're living through the period when doctors slowly began distinguishing between a substance's dramatic effects and its therapeutic benefits, not always the same thing. The emerging field of toxicology began systematically documenting arsenic's harms, gradually shifting it from medicine cabinet to poison control regulation. However, arsenic compounds remained in some official pharmacopoeias until the 1950s, demonstrating how stubbornly dangerous treatments could persist despite mounting evidence of harm. Section 7. After weeks of chemical treatments, your Victorian physician decides your system needs a different approach. What you require is the water cure, he pronounces with enthusiasm that fills you with dread. I shall refer you to a most excellent hydropathic establishment. Before you can protest, you're being bundled off to a water cure facility, where you'll discover that the Victorians found ways to make even the most basic element, water, into an instrument of medicinal torture. Hydrotherapy, or the water cure, emerged as one of the Victorian era's most popular alternative treatments. You're about to experience a medical philosophy that managed to be simultaneously progressive and punishing. Developed primarily by Vincent Priestnitz in Austria and popularized in England by doctors like James Wilson and James Manby Gully, hydrotherapy rejected the chemical excesses of mainstream medicine in favor of water's natural healing powers. No more mercury or arsenic, just water applied in dozens of increasingly uncomfortable ways. Arriving at the hydropathic establishment, likely a grand converted mansion in the countryside or a purpose-built facility resembling a cross between a hotel and a prison, you're immediately subjected to the diagnostic shower. Standing naked in a tiled room, you endure jets of cold water hitting you from multiple directions while attendants observe your reactions. Your screams, shivering, and skin coloration all provide valuable diagnostic information about your constitution. Welcome to Victorian spa treatment, where relaxation is decidedly not the priority. The daily regimen at a water cure establishment follows a punishing schedule that begins well before dawn. You're awakened around 5 a.m. for your first treatment, typically the dreaded wet sheet pack. Stripped naked again. Victorian hydrotherapy involved a surprising amount of nudity for such a supposedly prudish era. You're wrapped tightly in cold, wet sheets, then bundled in layers of dry blankets like a medical mummy. As your body heat gradually warms the sheets, you experience first intense cold, then profuse sweating. The process lasts several hours, during which you're completely immobilized and increasingly desperate to use the toilet. Hydrotherapists view your suffering as evidence of toxins leaving the body. Between major treatments, your day fills with various water-based torments. You might experience the sitz bath, sitting with your lower body submerged in cold water while your feet rest in a separate hot water bath, supposedly redirecting blood flow from inflamed organs. Or perhaps you'll enjoy the douche, standing against a wall while attendants direct pressurized cold water at specific body parts from a hose. The ascending douche, water directed upward at the genitals and rectum, was particularly favored for treating nervous disorders and sexual dysfunction. Victorian medicine never missed an opportunity to combine discomfort with embarrassment. Diet at hydropathic establishments reflects the same ascetic philosophy as the water treatments. You're served plain food with no seasonings, alcohol, tea, coffee, or meat, a surprisingly progressive diet by modern standards, but experienced as deprivation by Victorian patients accustomed to heavily spiced, meat-scented meals. Between the restricted diet, enforced exercise, and constant water treatments, many patients lost significant weight during their stays, a result interpreted as successful detoxification rather than the semi-starvation it actually represented. What makes Victorian hydrotherapy particularly interesting is its social dimension. Unlike many medical treatments available only to the wealthy, water cure establishments catered to a relatively broad middle and upper middle class clientele. You might find yourself taking the waters alongside anyone from Charles Darwin and Alfred Tennyson to factory owners and prosperous merchants. Hydropathic facilities became important social spaces where ideas circulated freely among patients spending weeks or months in treatment. Historians still argue about whether the networking opportunities provided by these establishments contributed more to patients' well-being than the actual water treatments. The gendered aspects of hydrotherapy reveal much about Victorian attitudes toward health. Women comprised the majority of hydropathic patients. often seeking relief from the nebulous female complaints that mainstream medicine treated with opiates and surgery. You'd notice that women's hydropathic regimens emphasized sedative treatments, cold compresses to the spine and abdomen to reduce nervous excitability, while men received more invigorating therapies designed to build strength. The underlying assumption that women suffered from excess energy while men needed revitalization speaks volumes about Victorian gender ideology. Despite its many uncomfortable aspects, hydrotherapy represented a genuine improvement over some conventional Victorian treatments. You might reasonably prefer a cold shower to bloodletting or mercury poisoning. The emphasis on exercise, moderate diet, and abstention from alcohol and tobacco genuinely benefited many patients, though these lifestyle changes, rather than the water itself, likely accounted for most improvements. When patients recovered after abandoning arsenic and laudanum in favor of the water cure, hydrotherapy received credit that might better have gone to the cessation of actively harmful treatments. The water cure's scientific justifications illustrate the fascinating pseudo-scientific reasoning characteristic of Victorian medicine. Your hydrotherapist explains with complete confidence that cold water tones blood vessels, that alternating hot and cold rebalances nervous fluidity, and that specific applications of water can draw inflammation from internal organs. These explanations sound scientific, but lack any basis in actual physiology. Victorian patients and practitioners alike found these theoretical frameworks convincing, despite their absence of evidence, a reminder that scientific-sounding language doesn't guarantee scientific validity. Not all hydropathic treatments were entirely without merit. You might benefit from some therapies that have modern counterparts, like contrast hydrotherapy, alternating hot and cold, for certain circulatory issues, or warm compresses for muscle pain. What distinguished Victorian hydrotherapy wasn't the complete absence of effective treatments, but rather the excessive claims made for those treatments and the often unnecessary suffering inflicted in their name. The principle that water could help heal certain conditions wasn't wrong. The application of that principle through extreme measures often was. After weeks of hydrotherapy, you emerge from the establishment physically exhausted, but perhaps genuinely improved. Whether your improvement stems from the water treatments themselves, the break from more harmful conventional medicine, the enforced rest and dietary changes, or simply the placebo effect, remains debatable. What's certain is that you've survived yet another Victorian medical ordeal with a newfound respect for the simple act of bathing on your own terms, without therapeutic intent or medical supervision. Sometimes the greatest luxury is freedom from treatment, a concept the treatment-obsessed Victorians rarely recognized. Section 8. Having survived the water cure, you find yourself facing a more serious health crisis, one requiring surgical intervention. The very thought sends chills down your spine, and with good reason. You're about to experience Victorian surgery, where speed trumped precision, where surgeons operated in street clothes splattered with the blood of previous patients, and where survival often seemed more a matter of luck than medical skill. Victorian surgery represents one of medicine's most dramatic transformations. You're living through the period when surgery evolved from a nightmarish last resort to a legitimate, occasionally life-saving medical specialty. At the beginning of the Victorian era, operations were performed without anesthesia, with patients fully conscious as surgeons cut through flesh and bone. By the end, anesthesia and antiseptic techniques had revolutionized surgical practice. Your surgical experience would differ dramatically depending on when, during Victoria's reign, you found yourself on the operating table. If you're unfortunate enough to require surgery in the 1830s or early 1840s, you face the full horror of pre-anesthetic surgery. entering the operating theatre, typically an amphitheatre-like room where spectators can watch your ordeal, you're strapped firmly to the table while assistants stand ready to hold you down. The surgeon explains that speed is essential and instructs you to remain as still as possible despite the pain. Some surgeons offer a leather strap to bite down on, or a shot of whiskey for courage. Neither helps much when the cutting begins. The surgeon's skill is measured primarily by speed rather than precision. You've selected your surgeon based on his reputation for quick work. A leg amputation in under 2 minutes, a bladder stone removal in under 5. The longer the operation, the less likely your survival, both from shock and blood loss. As the knife touches your flesh, your world explodes into agony. Spectators time the procedure, sometimes betting on its duration. Your screams join the ambient sounds of the operating theatre, a nightmarish soundtrack that haunts medical students' dreams. Everything changes in 1846 when news reaches Britain that an American dentist named William Morton has successfully demonstrated ether anesthesia. Within months, ether and chloroform transform Victorian surgery. You're infinitely more fortunate if your operation occurs after this revolutionary development. Instead of being held down, you receive a chloroform-soaked cloth over your face, drifting into blessed unconsciousness before the surgeon begins. When Queen Victoria herself receives chloroform during childbirth in 1853, the practice gains social acceptance even among conservative physicians who initially argued that pain was natural and beneficial. Historians still argue about whether anesthesia ultimately saved or cost more lives during the Victorian period. While it certainly spared patients unimaginable suffering, it also encouraged surgeons to attempt longer, more complex operations without addressing the problem of surgical infections. You might survive the operation itself, only to die days later from what Victorians called hospital fever, typically sepsis or gangrene. Surgical mortality rates actually increased in some hospitals after anesthesia introduction, as surgeons operated on patients previously considered too weak to survive the pain of surgery. The second great revolution in Victorian surgery comes in 1867 when Joseph Lister introduces antiseptic techniques. If you're fortunate enough to be operated on by a surgeon who has adopted Lister's methods, your surgical wound will be treated with carbolic acid, phenol, sprayed during the operation, and dressed with carbolic-soaked bandages afterward. The procedure still looks gruesome, the operating room filled with a mist of phenol that irritates everyone's eyes and lungs. But your chances of survival improve dramatically. Instead of almost certain infection, you have a fighting chance of leaving the hospital alive. Not all Victorian surgeons embrace these innovations. You might find yourself under the knife of an old-school surgeon who considers anesthesia an unnecessary coddling and germ theory an absurd fancy. These traditionalists continued operating as they always had, quickly, bloodily, and with minimal attention to cleanliness. Even as late as the 1880s, you might encounter surgeons who prided themselves on the accumulated bloodstains on their operating coats, seeing them as badges of experience rather than sources of infection. The surgical establishment resisted change with remarkable stubbornness, often to their patients' detriment. Victorian operating rooms bore little resemblance to their modern counterparts. You're being operated on in a space without running water, in a building that might lack even basic sewage systems. Your surgeon moves directly from the autopsy room to the operating theatre without changing clothes or washing hands. Instruments are wiped clean rather than sterilized, and the same sutures might be used on multiple patients. The operating table itself, wooden and porous, retains blood and bodily fluids from countless previous surgeries. Even in prestigious teaching hospitals, these conditions were standard until late in the century. The most common Victorian surgical procedures reflect both the era's limitations and its nascent progress. You'd likely be facing one of 4 operations: amputation for injuries, infections or tumors, lithotomy, removal of bladder stones, tumor excision or abscess drainage. More complex procedures remained extraordinarily dangerous. Abdominal surgery carried mortality rates exceeding 90% until the 1880s, when antiseptic and eventually aseptic techniques made survival more likely than death. Watching these statistics improve dramatically over Victoria's reign, you're witnessing one of medicine's most significant transformations. Surgical training in the Victorian era involved remarkably little hands-on practice before operating on living patients. Your surgeon likely learned his craft through observation and assisting, perhaps practicing techniques on cadavers if he attended a progressive medical school. Many surgeons performed their first solo operations with minimal preparation, beyond watching the procedure done by others. Formal surgical training programs developed only gradually during the Victorian period, meaning the skill level of your surgeon depended heavily on his personal experience and mentorship, rather than standardized education. If you survive your Victorian surgical experience, your post-operative care will be minimal by modern standards. Pain management consists primarily of opium preparations, administered irregularly and often inadequately. Your surgical wound will be checked infrequently, sometimes not until infection has already set in. Hospital wards are overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and staffed by overworked nurses with limited training. Even in the best hospitals, you'll share a ward with dozens of other patients, all in various stages of suffering or recovery. Your best hope is to be discharged as quickly as possible to recover at home, away from the hospital's miasmatic environment. The contrast between early and late Victorian surgical experiences illustrates medicine's uneven progress. If you underwent surgery in 1840, you endured conscious suffering that modern patients can scarcely imagine. By 1900, your experience might be recognizably similar to modern surgery in its fundamentals: anesthesia, antisepsis, and increasingly specialized techniques. You're living through a genuine medical revolution, one that transformed surgery from a terrorizing last resort to a legitimate healing art. The operating theatre changed from a place of virtually guaranteed suffering to one where pain could be prevented and healing might actually occur, a transformation that represents one of Victorian medicine's few unambiguous triumphs. Section 9. Back in your Victorian physician's consulting room, your recovery from surgery proceeds slower than expected. The doctor frowns thoughtfully before opening an ornate cabinet filled with dozens of labeled bottles, jars, and boxes. "I shall prepare a special mixture," he announces, measuring powders and liquids with a practiced hand. You're about to sample the bizarre world of Victorian pharmaceutical concoctions, remedies containing everything from ground mummies to strychnine, all mixed with scientific-seeming precision and administered with complete confidence. Victorian medicine cabinets contain some of history's strangest remedies, blending ancient traditions with industrial-age innovations. You're witnessing pharmacy in transition, caught between folk remedies, emerging pharmaceutical science, and outright quackery. The contents of your physician's elaborate medicine chest reflect this curious mixture, containing substances that had been used for centuries alongside newly synthesized chemicals, all prescribed according to theories ranging from the ancient to the cutting edge. The doctor hands you a carefully prepared potion. What might it contain? If you're suffering from digestive complaints, your mixture likely includes rhubarb, gentian, and possibly a touch of strychnine, yes, the poison, as a tonic. For respiratory issues, you might receive a syrup containing ammonia, ipecac, squill, and perhaps a touch of morphine to suppress coughing. Nearly all Victorian preparations included some combination of alcohol, opiates, and cathartics, powerful laxatives. a mixture guaranteed to make you feel different, if not necessarily better. What makes Victorian medicinal mixtures particularly fascinating is their inclusion of substances we now recognize as outright bizarre. You might be prescribed mummy powder, literally ground up Egyptian mummies imported for medicinal use, for bleeding or bruising. Volcanic ash appears in digestive remedies. Crushed beetles, including the famous Spanish fly, feature in preparations for everything from warts to sexual disorders. Gold, silver, and gemstone powders add a touch of expensive alchemy to prescriptions for wealthy patients. Your medicine might literally contain precious metals, expensive and useless in equal measure. The Victorian pharmacopoeia included numerous animal-derived substances that modern patients would find revolting. You could be prescribed ox bile for digestive issues, essence of beef, concentrated beef broth, for weakness, or pulverized crab shells for stomach acid. More exotic animal products included castoreum from beaver anal glands for nervous conditions, ambergris from whale intestines for heart complaints, and various animal testicles for revitalization. Perhaps most notoriously, you might receive a prescription for Sequard's elixir, an extract of crushed animal testicles that briefly became a sensation after physiologist Charles-Edouard Brown-Sequard claimed it restored his youthful vigor. Plant-based remedies formed the backbone of Victorian prescriptions, ranging from the effective to the worthless to the dangerous. You'd likely receive preparations containing digitalis, foxglove, for heart conditions, willow bark, containing salicylic acid, aspirin's precursor, for pain and fever, and ipecacuanha for respiratory conditions, all of which have legitimate medicinal properties. Alongside these would be countless botanical substances of questionable value: wormwood, mandrake root, belladonna, and hundreds of others, each with its own elaborate theory of action, but little evidence of effectiveness. The presentation of Victorian medicines reveals much about the era's approach to treatment. Your physician's concoction comes in an elegant glass bottle with an elaborate label listing its ingredients in Latin, a language neither you nor possibly even the doctor can read. This linguistic obscurity isn't accidental. It maintains medical authority through mystification. The medicine's likely bitter taste is considered evidence of its potency. If it tastes terrible, it must be doing something, right? Victorian patients expected medicine to be unpleasant, viewing palatability with suspicion. Too sweet to be effective was a common criticism of new preparations. Beyond your doctor's office, patent medicines dominated the Victorian pharmaceutical landscape. You might supplement your prescribed treatments with commercial preparations like Daffy's elixir, Turlington's balsam, or Hooper's female pills, products making extravagant claims while keeping their ingredients secret. These preparations typically contained high concentrations of alcohol and opiates, ensuring users felt some effect, even if their underlying condition remained unchanged. The Victorian patent medicine industry operated virtually unregulated until late in the century, allowing manufacturers to make fantastic claims while including ingredients ranging from benign herbs to potent narcotics and heavy metals. Historians still argue about whether the average Victorian was better served by professional or commercial medicines. Your physician's custom preparation, despite its dubious ingredients, might at least be tailored somewhat to your specific symptoms. Patent medicines, while often containing harmful substances, sometimes had the advantage of consistent formulation and occasionally included genuinely effective ingredients discovered through trial and error rather than medical theory. Neither option offered the safety or efficacy modern patients expect, but both reflected serious attempts to address suffering, however misguided. the physical act of taking Victorian medicine could be an ordeal in itself. You might be instructed to consume enormous pills the size of small pebbles, bitter powders mixed with water, or liquid preparations with alcohol percentages exceeding modern liquors. Dosing instructions often called for medicines to be taken until they produced specific effects, usually some form of bodily evacuation. Continue until purging begins, or take hourly until profuse perspiration occurs, were common directives, essentially instructing you to consume toxins until your body desperately tried to expel them. This focus on visible, dramatic effects rather than symptom relief persisted throughout the Victorian era. What's particularly striking about Victorian pharmaceutical practices is how they combined precise measurement with complete theoretical confusion. Your doctor measures your medication with careful attention to grains and drams, mixing ingredients according to complex formulas, and treating the process with scientific seriousness. Yet the theoretical framework guiding these precise measurements remains largely incoherent, a jumble of ancient humoral theories, vitalism, emerging chemical understanding, and personal clinical experience. It's as if the trappings of scientific method arrived before scientific understanding, creating a peculiar mixture of precision and confusion that characterizes much of Victorian medicine. As the century progressed, pharmaceutical practice gradually became more scientific, though change came unevenly. If you're receiving treatment in the 1890s rather than the 1840s, your medicines might include recently isolated pure compounds like acetylsalicylic acid, aspirin, manufactured with consistent quality control rather than compounded at the physician's discretion. The first synthetic drugs appear in your doctor's armamentarium, and some of the most egregiously ineffective or dangerous traditional ingredients begin disappearing from respectable practice. You're witnessing the birth of modern pharmacology, though the transition remains far from complete by Queen Victoria's death in 1901. Section 10. After months of various treatments, your Victorian physician grows concerned about your continued complaints. Leaning forward with newfound intensity, he asks probing questions about your moods, sleep patterns, and, if you're female, reproductive functions. His expression grows serious as he reaches his diagnosis: nervous exhaustion with hysterical tendency. If you're a woman in Victorian England, these words signal your entry into one of medicine's most troubling chapters: the treatment of so-called female hysteria and related nervous disorders. The Victorian concept of hysteria represents one of history's most pervasive medical misunderstandings. You're experiencing a diagnosis that functioned more as social control than legitimate medicine. The term hysteria, derived from the Greek word for uterus, reflected the ancient belief that a wandering womb caused mental and physical symptoms in women. Though Victorian physicians no longer literally believed in the wandering womb, they maintained that women's reproductive organs exerted mysterious and powerful influences on their mental health. Virtually any symptom a woman presented could be attributed to this catch-all diagnosis. The range of symptoms attributed to hysteria was astonishingly broad. You might be diagnosed with hysteria if you exhibited anxiety, insomnia, irritability, sexual desire or lack thereof, appetite changes, excessive intellectual interest, political opinions, religious enthusiasm, or simple dissatisfaction with your restricted social role. Physical symptoms including headaches, fatigue, digestive troubles, and menstrual irregularities also fell under hysteria's expansive umbrella. Essentially, any female behavior or symptom that inconvenienced others or challenged Victorian gender norms risked being labelled pathological. For middle and upper-class women, the most common treatment for hysteria was the rest cure, developed by American physicians Silas Weir Mitchell and eagerly adopted by British doctors. You would be confined to bed for weeks or months, forbidden from reading, writing, sewing, or engaging in any form of intellectual or physical activity. Enforced overfeeding, primarily with milk and fatty foods, aimed to increase your body weight. The treatment's goal was infantilization, reducing you to a childlike state of dependence and passivity. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's chilling story, The Yellow Wallpaper, draws directly from her experience with this treatment, depicting its potential to induce, rather than cure, mental distress. Lower-class women diagnosed with hysteria faced harsher treatments. You might receive painful electric shocks to the abdomen and genitals, ice baths, forced feeding, or even surgical interventions. Victorian workhouse infirmaries and asylums routinely treated hysterical women with moral therapy, a euphemism for breaking the patient's will through discipline and punishment. While wealthy women suffered in private rooms under the rest cure's enforced idleness, poor women endured painful hydrotherapies and physical restraints in institutional settings. Class determined not just the comfort of your treatment, but its fundamental approach. Perhaps the most infamous treatment for hysteria was pelvic massage, manual stimulation of the genitals by a doctor to induce hysterical paroxysm, orgasm, believed to temporarily relieve hysterical symptoms. You might find yourself receiving this treatment, performed with clinical detachment and not acknowledged as sexual despite its obvious nature. As the procedure became increasingly demanded, doctors complained of hand fatigue, spurring the development of the first vibrators, medical devices designed to make treating hysteria more efficient. Marketed as personal massagers for home use, these devices appeared in respectable medical catalogues and women's magazines, their true purpose obscured by euphemistic language. Historians still argue about the social function of hysteria diagnosis and treatment. Some view it primarily as a mechanism for controlling women who defied Victorian gender expectations, while others emphasize how the diagnosis gave women whose suffering was otherwise dismissed a recognized medical framework, however flawed. The truth likely combines both perspectives. You might find the hysteria diagnosis simultaneously validating your genuine suffering while pathologizing your legitimate dissatisfaction with restricted social roles. The gendered nature of nervous disorders extended beyond hysteria. While women received hysteria diagnoses, men with similar symptoms were typically diagnosed with neurasthenia or nervous exhaustion. You would receive markedly different treatments for essentially identical symptoms depending on your gender. A neurasthenic man would be prescribed outdoor exercise, travel, and stimulating activity, essentially the opposite of the rest cure given to hysterical women. This stark contrast reveals how Victorian medicine reinforced rather than questioned prevailing gender norms. Surgical treatments for female mental and nervous disorders represent Victorian medicine at its most misguided and harmful. By mid-century, gynecological surgeries became increasingly common for treating not just physical conditions, but psychological ones. You might be subjected to procedures including ovariotomy, ovary removal, hysterectomy, or clitoridectomy, clitoral removal, for symptoms including depression, sexual deviance, or simply defiant behavior. The American gynecologist J. Marion Sims, celebrated for his surgical innovations, perfected his techniques through experimental operations on enslaved women without anesthesia, a stark reminder of how race and class intersected with gender in determining medical treatment. The infamous tranquilizer chair and similar restraint devices remained in use for treating severe hysteria cases throughout the Victorian period. You might find yourself strapped into these devices for hours or days, unable to move, supposedly allowing your nervous system to rest. Some chairs included head coverings to deprive you of sensory stimulation, while others featured drainage systems for bodily waste, allowing long-term restraint. These mechanical restraints fell from favor in progressive institutions later in the century, but remained common in asylums catering to lower-class patients. The Victorian treatment of female mental health created a perfect double bind. If you accepted your restricted social role despite its frustrations, you might avoid medical intervention, but suffer from the genuine psychological effects of confinement to domestic duties and intellectual limitation. If you rebelled or showed signs of psychological distress, you risked being diagnosed with hysteria and subjected to treatments that often worsened your condition. Your choices narrowed to silent suffering or medicalized punishment disguised as treatment. As the Victorian era progressed, challenges to the hysteria paradigm emerged from early feminist physicians and neurologists, developing more nuanced views of mental health. You might be fortunate enough to consult a doctor influenced by these progressive thinkers, who might recognize your symptoms as responses to genuine restrictions rather than evidence of inherent female instability. By the century's end, the most extreme treatments began falling from favor, though the fundamental medicalization of female unhappiness persisted well into the 20th century. The Victorian treatment of female complaints reminds us how medicine can function either as liberation or control, depending on who wields its authority and to what purpose. Section 11. As you continue your Victorian medical journey, you develop a persistent cough accompanied by fatigue and weight loss. The doctor's expression grows grave as he examines you. "I fear it may be consumption," he says, using the era's ominous term for tuberculosis. You've just received one of the Victorian period's most dreaded diagnoses, one that would inspire an extraordinary range of treatments from the simply ineffective to the bizarrely dangerous, reflecting society's desperate response to this seemingly unstoppable disease. Tuberculosis loomed as the Victorian era's most feared illness, killing 1 in 7 people in England and Wales during the 19th century. You're facing a disease so pervasive that it shaped cultural aesthetics. The consumptive look of pale skin, bright eyes, and thin frames became fashionable even among the healthy. Consumption's prominence in literature, art, and music reflected its omnipresence in Victorian life. Young women wore white to emulate the pallor of TB sufferers, while the consumptive poet became a romantic archetype. Perhaps no disease has ever been so strangely aestheticized, while simultaneously causing such widespread devastation. Your initial treatment recommendations reveal the medical confusion surrounding tuberculosis. With no understanding of its bacterial cause, not discovered until Robert Koch identified Mycobacterium tuberculosis in 1882, doctors prescribed remedies based on virtually every medical theory available. You might receive cod liver oil to build the blood, creosote to disinfect the lungs, or compounds of gold, silver, or arsenic to strengthen vital force. Some physicians recommended horseback riding for its supposedly gentle bouncing motion that settled the tubercles, while others advised complete bed rest. This therapeutic chaos reflected medicine's desperate grasping for solutions to a disease it couldn't comprehend. Climate therapy emerged as one of consumption's most prescribed treatments. Your doctor likely recommends a change of air, perhaps to the seaside, mountains, or even overseas. Wealthy consumptives traveled to established sanitarium towns like Davos, Switzerland, or relocated to colonies in distant regions with supposedly beneficial climates. Egypt, Algeria, South Africa, and the American Southwest became destinations for lungers seeking healing. You might find yourself living as a climate refugee, part of a global migration of the ill searching for relief through geography rather than medicine. The poor, of course, remained in industrial cities' polluted air, their consumption treated with cheaper and often harsher remedies. The sanatorium movement gained momentum throughout the Victorian period, offering a standardized approach to consumption treatment. If you're wealthy enough to afford sanatorium care, you'd experience a regimen featuring abundant food, regulated rest, graduated exercise, and constant exposure to fresh air. Windows remained open, regardless of weather, with patients bundled in blankets on sleeping porches even during winter. The strict daily routine included carefully timed meals, rest periods, gentle walks, and medical examinations. A medicalized lifestyle that could last months or years. While sanatorium treatment probably helped some patients through improved nutrition and rest, its effectiveness came primarily from isolating infectious cases rather than any inherent curative power. For those who couldn't afford sanatorium care, home treatments for consumption ranged from the benign to the bizarre. You might try inhaling the fumes from burning pine needles, drinking donkey milk, applying mustard plasters to your chest, or consuming raw eggs mixed with brandy. Patent medicine manufacturers targeted desperate consumptives with products like Dr. Beatty's Consumption Specific or Jane's Expectorant, concoctions typically containing alcohol, opiates, and various secret ingredients. Some families moved to slaughterhouses, believing that breathing the air around freshly butchered meat could cure tuberculosis. The disease's terrible prognosis made even the strangest remedies seem worth trying. Surgical interventions for tuberculosis reveal Victorian medicine's increasing willingness to attempt invasive treatments for desperate conditions. By the late Victorian period, you might undergo artificial pneumothorax, intentionally collapsing a lung by injecting air into the pleural cavity, supposedly allowing the infected lung to rest. More extreme surgical approaches included thoracoplasty, removing ribs to permanently collapse the chest wall, and phrenic nerve crushing, paralyzing the diaphragm on one side. These procedures, performed without antibiotics and with limited anesthesia options, carried enormous risks while offering modest benefits at best. Historians still argue whether surgical treatments for tuberculosis represented medical progress or simply increasingly elaborate expressions of therapeutic desperation. Tuberculosis treatments varied dramatically by social class. If you're wealthy, your consumption might be treated with sea voyages, expensive mountain sanitaria, and exotic climate cures. Middle-class sufferers might access more modest sanitaria, or attempt to recreate the fresh air cure at home by sleeping with windows open and following sanitarium-like regimens. Working-class consumptives faced bleaker options, perhaps brief stays in charitable hospitals or workhouse infirmaries where they received minimal care while potentially infecting others. The poorest might receive no treatment at all, continuing to work until physically unable while spreading the disease to family members in crowded housing. Your social position determined not just your treatment quality, but your survival chances. The psychological burden of a consumption diagnosis could be as devastating as the physical symptoms. You've received what many Victorians considered a death sentence, one that might progress slowly with deceptive periods of improvement before eventual decline. Victorian literature captured consumption's psychological torment, the hope raised by each new treatment, the brief improvements followed by crushing relapses, the financial ruin of families pursuing increasingly expensive cures. Many patients spent their life savings on treatments, moving from doctor to doctor and remedy to remedy as the disease progressed. This pattern of desperate medical consumption itself became a recognized stage of the illness. Perhaps the most peculiar tuberculosis treatments involved animal contact. Some physicians prescribed drinking blood freshly drawn from cattle, believing it contained vital energy. Others recommended spending time in cow barns, as the animal's breath supposedly had healing properties. You might find yourself sitting for hours in slaughterhouses or stables, breathing deeply of the animal-filled air in hopes of arresting your disease. These treatments reflect both the desperation surrounding consumption and the lingering influence of folk remedies on formal Victorian medicine. When science offered few answers, doctors often incorporated traditional practices under new theoretical frameworks. The gradual understanding of tuberculosis's contagious nature toward the century's end dramatically changed approaches to the disease. Early Victorian consumptives were often kept close within the family circle, even sharing beds with healthy relatives. As germ theory gained acceptance, you might instead experience increasing isolation, with your dishes, linens, and even letters subjected to disinfection. Public health measures, including prohibitions on public spitting and campaigns against sharing drinking vessels, reflected growing awareness of transmission routes. The shift from viewing consumption as a constitutional weakness to recognizing it as a communicable infection represents one of Victorian medicine's most significant conceptual transformations. While effective antibiotic treatment remained decades in the future, the Victorian period saw the foundations laid for tuberculosis's eventual control. You're living through the crucial transition from miasmatic theories to germ theory, from aesthetic romanticization of the disease to scientific understanding of its mechanisms. The identification of the tuberculosis bacillus in 1882, the development of the tuberculin skin test in 1890, and early public health measures targeting transmission all emerged during the Victorian era. Though these advances came too late to save millions of Victorian consumptives, they began the long process of converting tuberculosis from an unstoppable scourge to a preventable and treatable condition. Section 12. While Victorian medicine subjected adults to countless questionable treatments, the era's approach to children's health presents an even more troubling picture. As you observe a Victorian mother administering medicine to her feverish child, you notice she's using a small bottle labeled Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup. What she doesn't realize is that this popular remedy contains significant amounts of morphine and alcohol, just one example of how Victorian children endured treatments that often caused more harm than the conditions they purported to cure. Children's medicine in the Victorian era operated under fundamentally different assumptions than modern pediatrics. You're witnessing an approach that viewed children essentially as small adults with identical physiological needs, merely requiring reduced dosages. The concept of specialized pediatric medicine emerged only gradually during this period. Until late in the century, most physicians received no specific training in children's health, applying the same therapeutic principles to patients of all ages. This one-size-fits-all approach proved particularly dangerous for the youngest and most vulnerable patients. The Victorian pharmaceutical market overflowed with products specifically marketed for children's ailments. You'd see advertisements for teething powders, cough syrups, worm medicines, and children's cordials in newspapers, magazines, and shop windows. What these colourful advertisements didn't mention was their products' dangerous ingredients. Teething preparations commonly contained mercury compounds. Children's syrups included morphine or other opiates, and cough remedies often featured alcohol, cannabis, antimony, or chloroform. Parents administered these potent drugs to children of all ages, from newborns to adolescents, believing they were providing safe, effective relief. Perhaps the most notorious children's medication was the aforementioned Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, which promised to help children through teething and various other discomforts. You might observe mothers administering this preparation to infants as young as a few weeks old. Each ounce contained 65 milligrams of morphine. enough to sedate a child into insensibility and occasionally enough to cause fatal respiratory depression. The product remained on the market from 1849 until the early 1900s, with advertisements featuring cherubic babies and grateful mothers. Similar products including Godfrey's Cordial, Street's Infant Quietness, and Atkinson's Infant Preservative likewise contained opiates, living up to their promise to quiet fussy babies by essentially drugging them unconscious. Teething was viewed with particular dread in Victorian households, considered not just uncomfortable, but potentially fatal. You'd find a bewildering array of teething treatments ranging from the benign to the toxic. Teething necklaces made of coral or amber were relatively harmless folklore remedies, but many commercial teething powders contained mercurous chloride, calomel. When applied directly to an infant's gums, these powders could cause excessive salivation, mouth ulcers, tooth loss, and systemic mercury poisoning. Yet advertisements presented them as gentle, natural remedies, and doctors routinely recommended them well into the late Victorian period. The Victorian approach to childhood fevers illustrates the era's misguided pediatric practices. You might observe a feverish child subjected to fever management that included ice baths, wrapping in cold, wet sheets, or even bloodletting. Children as young as 2 or 3 might have blood removed via leeches applied behind the ears or cups placed on their backs. These depleting treatments were particularly dangerous for young patients already weakened by illness. Antimony compounds, which induce vomiting and diarrhea, were commonly prescribed for childhood fevers, further dehydrating children who needed fluid conservation most. Digestive complaints received equally problematic treatments. Victorian children suffering from constipation might be given harsh mercurial laxatives or enemas containing irritating substances like soap or turpentine. For diarrhea, preparations containing lead, zinc compounds, or opium were standard remedies, treatments that either added toxic metals to a child's system or masked symptoms while allowing dehydration to progress. Stomach pains might be treated with carminative preparations containing alcohol, capsicum, hot pepper extract, or volatile oils that irritated delicate digestive tracts. These aggressive interventions reflected the Victorian belief that symptoms themselves were the disease, rather than signs of underlying conditions. Beyond pharmaceutical interventions, Victorian children endured physical treatments that modern parents would consider abusive. You might see children with persistent coughs subjected to chest blistering, the application of caustic substances that raised painful skin blisters, supposedly drawing out inflammation from the lungs. Children with spinal complaints or postural issues might wear restrictive metal braces for years, while those with orthopedic problems endured painful stretching treatments on various mechanical devices. The line between treatment and torture often blurred in Victorian pediatric. Children's nervous and behavioral issues received particularly misguided attention. You'd find hyperactive children prescribed bromides, sedative compounds that caused what we now recognize as bromide toxicity, including skin eruptions, neurological problems, and cognitive impairment. Children with epilepsy received combinations of bromides, chloral hydrate, and other sedatives that suppressed seizures at the cost of keeping them in a perpetually drugged state. For bedwetting, Victorian physicians recommended everything from dietary restrictions to genital cauterization, literally burning a child's genitals with silver nitrate to create a painful association with urination. The class dimensions of children's medicine reveal Victorian society's stark inequalities. If you observed a wealthy child's illness, you'd see a physician making house calls, prescribing expensive preparations, and recommending restorative trips to the seaside or countryside. Working-class children received briefer attention at dispensaries or outpatient departments, where overworked doctors had minutes rather than hours to evaluate and treat them. The poorest children might receive care only when seriously ill enough to warrant hospital admission, often arriving after home remedies and patent medicines had already worsened their condition. Historians still argue about whether Victorian attitudes toward children's pain differed fundamentally from modern sensibilities. Some sources suggest that children's suffering was viewed as less significant than adults, with their complaints more readily dismissed, or their treatment discomfort considered unimportant. Others point to evidence of genuine parental distress at children's suffering, and the popularity of products promising painless remedies. What's clear is that Victorian medical culture lacked our contemporary emphasis on minimizing pediatric treatment discomfort, viewing pain as an acceptable cost of therapy rather than something to be specifically addressed. Not all Victorian pediatric care was harmful. The era saw the establishment of the first children's hospitals, the beginning of specialized pediatric training, and growing recognition of children's unique physiological needs. You might encounter progressive Victorian physicians who rejected the most aggressive traditional treatments, advocating instead for supportive care, proper nutrition, and avoidance of harmful interventions. These medical pioneers faced an uphill battle against entrenched practices and commercial interests, but their work laid foundations for modern pediatrics. By the late Victorian period, medical textbooks began including specific sections on children's diseases, recognizing that treating children required specialized knowledge rather than simply reduced adult dosages. As the century progressed, growing awareness of patent medicine dangers led to the first regulations protecting children from the most hazardous preparations. The 1868 Pharmacy Act in Britain placed modest restrictions on opiate-containing products, requiring them to be labelled as containing poison, though enforcement remained lax. Not until the early 20th century would effective regulation remove the most dangerous substances from children's medications. Victorian children, caught between traditional practices, commercial exploitation, and emerging but incomplete medical knowledge, endured some of history's most misguided treatments, while serving as unwitting test subjects for pediatric medicine's gradual evolution towards scientific validity. Section 13. The sharp pain in your jaw has become unbearable, forcing you to contemplate one of the Victorian era's most dreaded experiences, a visit to the dentist. As you approach the dentist's shop, identifiable by the display of extracted teeth in the window, your steps slow involuntarily. Inside awaits a world of dental treatments that combined genuine innovation with medieval-level suffering, where cocaine served as a cutting-edge anesthetic and false teeth might come from the battlefield's dead. Victorian dentistry occupied a peculiar middle ground between skilled trade and medical profession. You're seeking treatment from a practitioner whose training might range from a formal medical education to simple apprenticeship, or perhaps no training at all. Until the 1878 Dentists Act, anyone could declare themselves a dentist and begin practicing. Your neighborhood might have several dental practitioners, from university-trained surgeon dentists charging fees only the wealthy could afford, to operators for the teeth, offering budget extractions at the local barbershop or marketplace. Choose wisely. Your jaw's fate depends on it. The Victorian dental office bears little resemblance to its modern counterpart. You enter a space that might double as the dentist's living quarters, with perhaps a single specialized chair facing a window to maximize natural light. The instruments laid out on a nearby table, excavators, pluggers, forceps, and drills, are hand-powered and often handmade by the dentist himself. No electrical equipment hums in the background. Everything from drilling to polishing relies on manual dexterity and strength. The office smells of tobacco, the dentist might smoke while working to mask the odor of patients' mouths, medicinal creosote, and oil of cloves, the latter two being common remedies for toothache. For most of the Victorian period, dental patients faced a harrowing choice: endure procedures without anesthesia or risk their lives with available options. If you visit the dentist before the mid-1840s, pain relief consists primarily of alcohol or opiates that dull the pain without eliminating it. After 1846, ether and chloroform become available, but their administration carries significant risks, including death, particularly when used by inadequately trained practitioners for relatively minor procedures. Many patients choose to remain conscious during dental work, gripping the chair arms while assistants stand ready to hold them down if necessary. The introduction of cocaine as a dental anesthetic in the 1880s revolutionizes pain management, though not without creating new problems. You might be among the first patients to experience local anesthesia, as your dentist injects cocaine solution directly into your gums. The pain relief seems miraculous compared to earlier options, but dosage remains imprecise. Some patients receive too little for effective numbness, while others experience cocaine toxicity with racing heartbeat, anxiety, and even seizures. Additionally, the hypodermic syringes used for injection are rarely sterilized between patients, creating new infection risks that sometimes prove more dangerous than the original dental problem. Tooth extraction remains the default treatment for most dental problems throughout the Victorian era. You might have a tooth pulled for issues modern dentists would easily treat: minor decay, sensitivity, or even temporary pain. The extraction process without adequate anesthesia ranks among the most traumatic medical experiences of the period. The dentist uses progressively larger forceps to grasp and loosen the tooth, often breaking the crown and necessitating painful extraction of remaining roots. Blood loss can be significant, and post-extraction infections common. Wealthier patients might remain in the dentist's care during recovery. Working-class patients typically stagger home to manage pain and bleeding themselves. For those who can afford it, tooth restoration offers an alternative to extraction. You might receive a filling made from dental amalgam, a mixture of mercury, silver, tin, and copper, gold foil, or cement. The process involves manually drilling the decay with hand-powered drills, a slow, painful process that could take hours for a single tooth. Cavity preparation follows no standardized approach, with each dentist developing their own techniques. The resulting fillings, while functional, often fail due to continued decay around the edges or poor adhesion. Victorian dental restorations represent a genuine attempt at preservation rather than extraction, but their execution and success rates reflect the era's limited understanding of oral bacteria and materials science. Perhaps nothing reveals Victorian dentistry's peculiar character better than its approach to dentures and artificial teeth. If you require false teeth, the materials available depend entirely on your social class. Wealthy patients might receive porcelain dentures mounted on gold or silver plates, custom fitted and relatively comfortable. Middle-class patients typically get vulcanite dentures, hardened rubber bases with porcelain teeth. The poorest patients, if they replace missing teeth at all, make do with carved bone or wooden dentures that warp from moisture and quickly become breeding grounds for bacteria. The source of artificial teeth creates one of Victorian dentistry's most macabre practices. While porcelain teeth become increasingly available throughout the period, many dentists and patients prefer natural teeth for their superior appearance and durability. These natural teeth come primarily from two sources: executed criminals and battlefield casualties. Waterloo teeth, harvested from soldiers killed during the Napoleonic Wars, remain in circulation throughout much of the Victorian period. You might literally wear a dead man's teeth, extracted from corpses, and reset into dental plates. Only gradually does the growing availability of quality porcelain teeth end this ghoulish practice. Dental products for home use reflect the same combination of innovation and hazard found in professional treatment. You might attempt to whiten your teeth using abrasive tooth powders containing brick dust, chalk, or crushed cuttlebone, substances that removed stains by physically scraping away tooth enamel. Toothache remedies for home use include oil of cloves, relatively effective, creosote, toxic and caustic, and various alcohol-based preparations containing anything from opium to cayenne pepper. Victorian bathroom cabinets hold dental preparations capable of providing temporary relief while often causing long-term damage. Preventive dentistry barely exists for most of the Victorian period. You receive little advice about oral hygiene beyond basic cleanliness, with toothbrushing still not universally practiced. Sugar consumption increases dramatically during the era due to falling prices, while understanding of its relationship to dental decay remains limited. Regular dental checkups are virtually unknown. Most patients visit dentists only when in pain. This reactive rather than preventive approach ensures that dental problems progress to advanced stages before treatment, making interventions more painful and less successful than they might otherwise be. By the late Victorian period, dentistry begins its transformation into a regulated scientific profession. You might encounter dentists using the first electric drills, though these early models run at dangerously high speeds, improved anesthetics, including nitrous oxide, and more standardized training following the 1878 Dentists Act. Dental X-rays, invented in 1896, arrive at the very end of the Victorian era, allowing practitioners to visualize problems before intervention for the first time. These advances represent dentistry's first steps toward its modern form, though truly effective and relatively painless treatment remains decades in the future. As you leave the dentist's office, perhaps minus a tooth or with a crude filling in place, you reflect on how dental health serves as a visible class marker in Victorian society. The wealthy display full sets of healthy or properly restored teeth into old age. The middle classes show evidence of interventions and repairs. The poor exhibit gaps and decay that reflect their limited access to care. Your smile, or lack thereof, instantly communicates your social position to Victorian society. Few aspects of healthcare so visibly manifest social inequality as dentistry, where economic privilege remains literally written on patients' faces throughout the era. Section 14. The depths of Victorian medicine's peculiar treatments extended nowhere more disturbingly than into the realm of mental health care. As you pass the imposing walls of a Victorian lunatic asylum, the distant sounds of patients' cries drift through barred windows. These institutions, often called madhouses in early Victorian times and gradually renamed as asylums or mental hospitals, represented society's primary approach to mental illness, segregation, combined with treatments that ranged from merely ineffective to actively torturous. Victorian psychiatry, or alienism as it was then called, operated from fundamentally flawed understandings of mental illness. You're observing a field caught between competing theories. Some physicians viewed mental disorders as purely physical brain diseases requiring bodily interventions, while others saw them as moral or spiritual failings requiring discipline and correction. Neither approach recognized the complex interplay of biological, psychological, and social factors we now understand contribute to mental health. This theoretical confusion led to treatments that addressed neither the brain's biology nor the mind's psychological needs effectively. The Victorian asylum system expanded dramatically during Queen Victoria's reign. You're witnessing Britain's first attempt at systematic mental health care, with the 1845 Lunacy Act, mandating that each county build public asylums. What began as a reform movement with humanitarian intentions gradually transformed into a vast network of overcrowded institutions, housing not just those with serious mental illnesses, but also epileptics, people with developmental disabilities, those with dementia, and often individuals whose behaviors simply defied social norms. By 1900, over 100,000 people resided in British asylums, many admitted involuntarily and remaining for decades or life. For wealthy patients, private asylums offered somewhat better conditions. You might observe gentlemen's or ladies' asylums, where affluent patients enjoyed private rooms, extensive grounds, and recreational activities. Treatment still centered around control and containment, but with more comfortable surroundings and less overtly punitive measures. Middle-class families often faced financial ruin trying to maintain relatives in these expensive facilities, while working-class patients entered county asylums where overcrowding, minimal staffing, and institutional economies of scale created warehouse-like conditions focused on custody rather than cure. Physical restraint remained central to Victorian psychiatric practice, despite growing criticism. You'd see patients in straitjackets, bound to chairs or beds, or locked in isolation rooms, often for behaviors we now recognize as symptoms rather than willful defiance. Early Victorian asylums featured elaborate restraint devices, including the tranquilizing chair, where patients could be immobilized for hours or days. While reformers like John Connolly advocated for non-restraint approaches, these gained only partial acceptance. Even in progressive institutions, mechanical restraints were often simply replaced with chemical restraints, heavy sedation using chloral hydrate, bromides, or powerful opiates. The treatments inflicted on asylum patients reflect Victorian psychiatry's desperate experimentation. You might witness patients subjected to hydrotherapy in the form of surprise ice baths or high-pressure water jets, intended to shock them back to sanity. Spinning chairs and beds that rotated at high speeds supposedly realigned the brain's contents. Purging remained standard practice, with powerful emetics and laxatives administered under the theory that mental illness stemmed from morbid matter in the body. Electric shock therapy, though crude and uncontrolled compared to modern approaches, gained popularity toward the century's end. Each treatment generation brought new interventions that seemed scientific by contemporary standards, but typically proved ineffective or harmful. Diet therapy exemplifies the pseudo-scientific reasoning behind many Victorian psychiatric treatments. You'd find asylum physicians prescribing specific dietary regimens based on theories about mental illness's physical origins. Some patients received stimulating diets heavy in meat and spices for conditions considered to involve insufficient nervous energy, while others endured calming regimens of bland foods for supposedly overexcited conditions. Force feeding using stomach tubes became routine for patients who refused food, whether due to depression, delusions, or simply justifiable protest against their confinement and treatment. The psychological trauma of force feeding only compounded patients' distress, often worsening the very symptoms it supposedly addressed. The gendered nature of Victorian psychiatric diagnosis and treatment reveals much about the era's social control function. You'd notice women being institutionalized for behaviors that, in men, might be tolerated or addressed through other means. Moral insanity, a diagnosis applied primarily to women who defied gender norms through sexual assertiveness, intellectual pursuits, or independence, could lead to years of confinement. Female asylum patients disproportionately received diagnoses like hysteria and treatments focused on reproductive organs, including ovarian compression, applying painful pressure to the abdomen, and even surgical removal of ovaries or clitoridectomy for for cases involving sexual deviance or excessive desire. Victorian psychiatric medication relied heavily on sedation rather than targeting specific symptoms. You might see attendants distributing evening doses of chloral hydrate, a powerful hypnotic, potassium bromide, a sedative anticonvulsant, or various opium preparations to entire wards of patients, regardless of their individual conditions. These chemical straitjackets made patients more manageable, but often worsened their mental state through side effects, including cognitive dulling, skin eruptions, gastrointestinal distress, and dependency. The goal was institutional order rather than individual recovery, with quieter wards considered successful regardless of patients' actual mental states. Work therapy, or moral therapy, represented one of Victorian psychiatry's more humane innovations, though its implementation often fell short of its ideals. You might observe patients engaged in agricultural work, domestic tasks, or simple crafts, activities believed to provide structure and purpose. In practice, this frequently devolved into unpaid labor benefiting the institution, rather than therapeutic occupation benefiting patients. Male patients worked farms that fed the asylum, while female patients did laundry, sewing, and cleaning, maintaining gender norms even within institutional walls. For some patients, these activities provided genuine relief from the monotony of asylum life. For others, they constituted exploitation disguised as treatment. The architecture of Victorian asylums reveals their conflicting purposes. You'd approach impressive facades designed to resemble country houses or elegant institutions, projecting an image of enlightened care to the surrounding community. Inside, however, the buildings featured locked wards, surveillance systems, and designs prioritizing control over comfort. Later, Victorian asylums adopted the pavilion layout with separate buildings connected by corridors, an improvement over earlier unified structures, but still fundamentally institutional. These buildings embodied the tension between the humanitarian reform impulse that created the asylum system and the control imperative that came to dominate it. As the Victorian era progressed, pessimism gradually replaced initial optimism about asylum treatment. You'd encounter the growing concept of hereditary degeneration, the theory that mental illness represented evolutionary regression that could be passed to future generations. This perspective, championed by influential psychiatrists like Henry Maudsley, viewed most serious mental illnesses as largely incurable and led to increasingly custodial rather than therapeutic approaches. By the century's end, asylums functioned primarily as warehouses for society's unwanted, with recovery rates declining as chronic patients accumulated in overcrowded facilities. What began as a reform movement ended the Victorian period as a system in crisis, setting the stage for the even more aggressive biological interventions of the early 20th century. Despite this bleak picture, seeds of more enlightened approaches appeared late in the Victorian period. You might encounter physicians beginning to listen to patients' experiences, rather than simply observing their behaviors. Early talking therapies attempting to understand psychological causes of distress, and the first outpatient clinics offering alternatives to institutionalization. These developments remained marginal during the Victorian era, but represented crucial first steps toward more humane and effective approaches to mental health care. The Victorian asylum system's failures eventually prompted the reforms that would gradually replace it, though not until well into the following century. Section 15. As your Victorian medical journey nears its end, you find yourself reflecting on this strange era's medical legacy. Standing in a modern hospital that's just opened its doors in the final years of Queen Victoria's reign, you notice both the shadows of the past and glimmers of the future. The white-coated physicians still prescribe some questionable remedies, but they also used stethoscopes, thermometers, and even early X-ray machines. You're witnessing medicine in transition, a profession slowly, painfully transforming from medieval brutality, dressed in scientific language, to something approaching modern medical practice. The Victorian era's contribution to medical progress remains paradoxical. You've lived through a period that simultaneously embraced both harmful traditional treatments and revolutionary scientific advances. The same decade might see both the discovery of anesthesia and the continued prescription of mercury compounds. The same hospital might house both crude bloodletting and sophisticated bacteriological laboratories. This contradiction defines Victorian medicine, a field in which the past and future uneasily coexisted, with patients caught in the turbulent middle ground between harmful tradition and evidence-based innovation. Statistics tell the story of medicine's gradual improvement over Victoria's 64-year reign. You're part of a population whose life expectancy increased from about 40 years in 1837 to nearly 50 by 1901. Child mortality decreased, though it remained shockingly high by modern standards. Epidemics became less frequent and less deadly as public health measures improved water quality and waste disposal. These population-level gains came less from dramatic medical breakthroughs than from unglamorous public health engineering. Sewers, clean water systems, and building regulations that gradually transformed the disease-ridden environment of early Victorian cities. The germ theory of disease stands as perhaps Victorian medicine's most transformative contribution. You've witnessed the remarkable transition from miasma theory, the belief that disease spread through bad air or noxious vapors, to the understanding that specific microorganisms cause specific diseases. This conceptual revolution, driven by scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, fundamentally altered medicine's approach to both prevention and treatment. By recognizing invisible organisms as disease agents rather than vague bad airs or imbalanced humors, medicine gained the theoretical framework necessary for targeted interventions, rather than general depleting treatments. Public health measures improved more consistently than individual medical treatments. You might notice that while doctors still debated the merits of bloodletting for individual patients, cities implemented effective sewage systems, garbage collection, housing regulations, and clean water supplies that benefited entire populations. This public health revolution occurred unevenly. Wealthy neighborhoods received infrastructure improvements decades before poor areas, but its overall impact dwarfed that of clinical medicine during the Victorian period. The boring, unglamorous work of sanitary engineers saved more lives than the most brilliant physicians. The professionalization of medicine created more consistent standards, but also excluded previously accepted practitioners. You're observing medicine's transformation from a varied field including many women healers, herbalists, and empirics, practitioners relying on experience rather than formal theory, to a profession dominated by university-educated men. The 1858 Medical Act established the medical register and formal qualifications, gradually eliminating irregular practitioners. While this improved training standards, it also narrowed the field's diversity and perspectives. Women physicians fought bitter battles for education and recognition, with pioneers like Elizabeth Blackwell and Elizabeth Garrett Anderson establishing precedents that would slowly open medicine to women. Nursing underwent perhaps the Victorian era's most complete transformation. You've witnessed nursing evolve from a low-status occupation performed by untrained, often intoxicated attendants to a respected profession with standardized training. Florence Nightingale's reforms, beginning with her work in the Crimean War and continuing through her establishment of the first secular nursing school at St. Thomas's Hospital in 1860, revolutionized patient care. By the late Victorian period, Trained nurses with clean uniforms, systematic approaches, and professional standards had replaced the neglectful attendants of earlier decades, dramatically improving patient outcomes through basic but consistent care. Victorian medicine's relationship with pain reveals much about the era's values and limitations. You've lived through anesthesia's introduction, a revolutionary development that eliminated surgical suffering that had been considered inevitable for millennia. Yet pain relief remained inconsistently applied, with many physicians believing that pain served important diagnostic and therapeutic functions. Children, women, and working-class patients typically received less pain management than adult male and wealthy patients. This willingness to accept others' suffering as necessary or even beneficial represents one of Victorian medicine's most troubling ethical failures, one that echoes through many of its treatment approaches. The rise of specialization gradually improved treatment quality in specific fields. You might notice the emergence of dedicated specialists in ophthalmology, dermatology, orthopedics, and other fields. Practitioners focusing on particular body systems rather than claiming expertise across all conditions. This specialization allowed for deeper knowledge and more refined techniques within narrower domains. By the late Victorian period, you'd be more likely to have eye problems treated by an ophthalmologist than a general practitioner, a significant improvement in care quality. However, this specialization remained primarily available to wealthy patients, with the poor still receiving generalized care of variable quality. Victorian medical research established methodologies still used today. You've witnessed the development of clinical trials, statistical analysis of outcomes, laboratory research, and systematic observation, approaches that gradually separated effective treatments from useless or harmful ones. Physicians like Pierre-Louis pioneered the use of statistics to evaluate bloodletting's effectiveness, while researchers like Koch established criteria for proving disease causation. These methodological advances, though inconsistently applied during the Victorian period, laid essential groundwork for evidence-based medicine. The Victorian era saw medicine begin its long, uneven transition from art based primarily on tradition to science based primarily on evidence. As the century ends, Victorian medicine's most troubling legacy remains its reinforcement of social inequality. You've observed how treatment quality, access to specialists, hospital accommodations, and even diagnostic categories varied dramatically by social class, gender, and race. The poor received cursory care in overcrowded wards or outpatient departments, while the wealthy enjoyed private rooms and personalized attention. Women's complaints were frequently dismissed or misattributed to reproductive organs, while racial minorities often received explicitly different treatment based on pseudo-scientific theories about biological differences. These disparities, though somewhat narrowed by public hospitals and clinics, remained entrenched throughout the period and beyond. As you step out of the Victorian age and into the 20th century, medicine stands at a crossroads. The worst excesses of traditional heroic medicine, excessive bloodletting, mercurial compounds, purging, are finally fading, though not yet gone. Germ theory has provided a valid framework for understanding infectious disease, though effective treatments remain limited. Surgery has become survivable thanks to anesthesia and antisepsis, though still highly risky. Public health measures have begun transforming the disease environment, though unevenly across social classes. You're leaving behind a medical landscape that, despite its continuing flaws and limitations, has begun its halting progress toward modern scientific medicine, a transformation that came too late for countless Victorian patients, but would eventually revolutionize human health and longevity. As the lights of the Victorian era dim and the new century dawns with its own medical challenges and innovations, the lessons of this strange medical period remain relevant. Progress occurs unevenly. Harmful treatments persist alongside beneficial ones, and social factors influence care quality as much as scientific understanding. The peculiar remedies Victorian doctors prescribed, from mercury pills to electrical shocks, from arsenic tonics to surgical interventions for moral conditions, remind us that medical certainty in any era deserves skepticism. Perhaps the most important Victorian medical legacy is this cautionary lesson. Even the most confident medical pronouncements of any period, including our own, may eventually seem as misguided as a physician prescribing leeches for pneumonia or asylum confinement for a woman's independence of mind. The rhythm of your breathing deepens as you contemplate medicine's journey from the Victorian age through to modern times. The details of strange treatments and their consequences begin to soften around the edges, like old photographs fading gently into history. The harsh realities of bloodletting and mercury poisoning, of asylum restraints and surgical infections, gradually dissolve into the mists of time, leaving behind lessons learned at terrible cost. As your consciousness drifts towards sleep, you might feel a moment of profound gratitude for the medical advances that followed the Victorian period. The antibiotics that would have saved countless consumption victims, the vaccines that would have prevented childhood epidemics, the psychiatric medications that would have emptied the asylums, all lay just beyond the Victorian horizon, tantalizingly close, yet still out of reach. Your breathing slows further as you sink deeper toward restful sleep. The images of Victorian medical treatments, the leeches and lancets, the electrical devices and surgical instruments, the bottles of laudanum and arsenic compounds, lose their sharp edges and threatening aspects. They transform into historical curiosities rather than immediate dangers, artifacts of a medical approach that, for all its flaws, represented humanity's genuine attempt to understand and overcome suffering. In these final moments before sleep claims you completely, perhaps you hear the distant echoes of those Victorian patients whose suffering eventually led to better understanding. Their experiences, however painful, were not entirely in vain. Each treatment failure, each observed side effect, each recovery that occurred despite rather than because of intervention, all contributed to the slow accumulation of medical knowledge. Those long-gone Victorian patients, subjected to treatments we now recognize as harmful or useless, unknowingly participated in medicine's difficult evolution toward more effective, less harmful approaches.